So I've entitled this Taking Valuation for Granted, assessing the links between commercial policy and economic valuations of natural capital in the UK and Singapore. And this is a piece of research which is sponsored by a British Academy small grant to look into a comparative study of the approaches that are being taken by the UK and by Singapore in valuation of natural capital, which I'll come on to as to definitions as we move things forward. I was going to say as well, because we're in Singapore, good morning, Daja hao, Selamat pagi, and if you're from Japan, Ohayou gozaimasu, where I just came back from as well. And without further ado, I think I'll just very briefly cover these three photographs that you can see on the screen, just to illustrate the amenity value that we often associate or don't associate with what I call natural capital assets. So at the bottom of the screen, first two photographs, this is the Peak District National Park in Yorkshire, United Kingdom, which is very close to my home and has become over the years very close to my heart. One of the reasons I went to university in Sheffield was so that I could explore the Peak District National Park and enjoy more hiking activities on the nature trails and seeing the birds of prey, for example. And there's a lot of moorland and peatland, which is in its restored state of great value to carbon storage, and I say carbon storage in the broadest of terms. On the right-hand side, I took a walk on Sunday up to I took a run, in fact, 12k walk and run in the Makritchie Reservoir anti-clockwise route, and one of the most enjoyable aspects of that adventure was the long-tailed macaques. Which again gave me substantial pleasure to see these creatures in their natural habitat, scratching their bellies, enjoying themselves, being a little bit cautious as they were walking around, and probably getting some feed from the other hikers and tourists along the way. So why the anecdote? Well, a part of this story, a part of the valuation of natural capital is, as I say, the amenity value that these assets give us. This can be measured by way of what we call options value or willingness to pay studies, is one method of looking at how much would we be willing to pay to sacrifice not the use of, but the amenity provided by these monkeys, for example. This is a man-made reservoir, the Ladybow Reservoir in Sheffield. But these public goods, these beautiful vistas that we all enjoy for free, what would we be willing to pay to sacrifice the use of those is one method of looking at the environmental economic value of such assets. And I'll come on to the many other methods that we can use in valuing natural capital beyond the traditional economic valuation approach of how productive is this land in terms of commodity value, for instance. How much wheat can it produce? What will be the contribution to gross domestic product, GDP, of the housing build that we're undertaking on this land? And by no means is this a new initiative or a reinvention of the wheel. This is an ongoing debate around how we can both value these natural resources but also promote their valuation among policymakers and among businesses and society. Of course, not simply to put a price on nature and then to commoditize it further and cause those who may be exploiting it to take further advantage through markets, but to raise awareness to an extent of the potential value of these assets. So why do I want to do some research around this is the question that I asked myself when I arrived in Singapore, because this research is only 3 weeks old. And the motivations include in the literature an identification that firstly measurement and valuation is needed and can contribute to solving the problem of commercial organizations, as I say, over hundreds of years, making use of the productive value of nature and also potentially causing harms, well, not potentially, actually causing harms and degradation in nature, with a view that these assets, as I call them, are self-replenishing. They are non-rivalrous, i.e. we don't have to compete to use them. Air, for example, it's sort of freely available. As I say, things like the amenity value of views. We want them to remain public goods, right? We don't want to have to start paying for our parks, for example. I think it's fair to say that most of us would not find popular the idea of charging for the use of every single park, for instance. So we want them to remain a public good, but as I'll show later on, there is this question of harms that's coming to the forefront of the not just sort of activist agenda, but which it has been for a very long time, but the sort of international community of governance and business, including finance and insurance. Why the big guns? Because of the increasing risk. Catastrophe risk, increased risk of flooding, more earthquakes, more tsunamis. You've got Bill Gates saying in his How to Prevent a Climate Disaster that if the core temperature of the Earth raises by 2 degrees over the next 20, 30 years, there will be substantial flood risk increase. This could impact Singapore. It's an insular nation, right? It already has some flood risk issues in, I believe, the south and east, as does the UK. And so, what do natural assets offer? They offer ecosystem services. What are ecosystem services? Some of the functions of these ecosystem services include carbon storage, nitrogen storage, phosphorus storage, biodiversity, and potentially the provision of nature-based power, renewable, hydro, wind, solar, for example. So these assets have an intrinsic and an extrinsic economic value. In other words, a tree is worth more than simply the commodity value of the wood. So this is a wide arena, okay? It is, the more I have been involved in environmental economic work, the more I realise there is to learn. And the story of this is I was at King's College London working in the Lao China Institute, and I'd been working on foreign investment in the Chinese stock market, which is quite an unrelated field, but it has the anchor of economics and finance at the centre. And I was quite unsatisfied with the trajectory of my career, to be frank. And I had a meeting with colleagues and I said, yeah, I'm not fulfilling what I believe to be, a purposeful mission in life. And they said, well, what about consultancy? So I looked at options, and an agent represented me, and I ended up becoming the evaluation economist for a national infrastructure project called the UK Superfast Broadband Programme, which looked to supply broadband to rural areas in the UK and indeed to the whole of the UK, or 95% plus in the UK. And this then led eventually to a piece of work I was asked to do for the Department for the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, which was to look at what's the economic case for improving our data collection across natural assets across the whole of England, to include mapping of fields, grasslands, taking of soil samples, so a science-led programme, taking of soil samples, temperatures, pH levels, and looking at things like the impact of pesticide use by farmers and agriculture. When it rains, the runoff from that agricultural use of pesticides can get into the water system and cause pollution. So what will be the economic and societal value of collecting much better data for the purposes of public use effectively and potentially commercial use downstream of that data collection? And I found that this sun diagram sort of illustrates how wide a set of issues we've got here. I'll take one as an example, housing, which affects Singapore and the UK, right? Growing populations, a need for development, a lobby for development, a commercial lobby of developers who want there to be more houses built, and a need, a very real need, but also intuitively a very clear harm caused to, whether it's brownfield or greenfield sites. There's going to be a biodiversity loss, period, when it comes to development. There is an idea of, trying to achieve, biodiversity net gain through development, and by no means are some of the efforts, certainly by the Singaporean government, to promote urban farming, for instance, to be understated or undervalued. However, there is, of course, the question of so-called greenwashing. If we look at the JP Morgan building, for example, absolutely beautiful, without a doubt, the most green financial centre I've ever seen in the world. Plants hanging out of floors, certain floors dedicated, it seems, to, out indoor gardens and so on. Is that greenwashing or not? Is it? I think it's a sign that there are some businesses who are growing in their commitment to a sustainability focus, to a corporately, socially responsible effort. And the reason I think that to be the case is because I've had conversations with industry practitioners who have a very genuine interest, a business interest, but also a wider interest in understanding these spheres. So this is why I think it's important that we understand things like how much is there of known and unknown natural capital in, for example, Singapore and England, and what ecosystems are provided. How can we value these things? And how perhaps could this understanding of value contribute towards bridging public and private financing? Because there's this idea, well, it's informative to policymakers, but I don't think we've quite got there as to how we can really engage commercial actors in making use of this information and making use of this data yet. So that's sort of the questions that I'm heading towards. I'm going to skip this slide on defining natural capital assets because I don't think we need to go there, and just in the interests of time. So I've spoken about the traditional view on natural capital assets, and please do interrupt me if you have any questions as we go through. I'm happy to take questions as we go along. I've spoken about some of the economic qualities of nature, that it's non-market, it's non-rivalrous, it's self-replenishing. We've also got an introduction of carbon taxes. I know at the border of Singapore there's an idea of sort of trying to achieve a net zero there. But for policymakers in general, nature is a market failure. That means that the market doesn't value, in effect, doesn't value nature, doesn't pay for nature for these reasons. So it requires an intervention. And there are many ways that we can look at the value of these ecosystem services. And I've listed just a few here that I've called sort of the ABC: air quality, biodiversity, carbon storage, amenity, flood risk protection of trees, for example, nitrogen reduction, pollination services by insects that helps generate more abundance in species, helps generate more abundance in flowers that we can enjoy. And there are systems that we don't yet understand. We have to accept that science is still getting there. It tells us a lot, but it's an ongoing process of understanding nature. At a high level, you have these events like the COP events. I believe there was one held in October last year in Montreal. where the Kunming-Montreal Biodiversity Framework was sort of signed up to, and Singapore and the UK will have had high profile in those meetings among very high level officials, diplomats and senior leaders across governments. And this sign up to 30 by 30, the idea of by 2030 ensuring that both marine and land protections are extended to at least 30% of the territorial areas. Commitments to restoring degraded land and protecting species and halting extinction targets are a part of that. Now, as I said, this is not the first attempt at looking at valuation. The TEEB, the UN-supported TEEB work, has done a very thorough job of looking at, I think it's something like, including its evolution, which this is the De Groot original service categorization of ecosystem services. Something like 2,500, 2,600 papers have been explored as to the sort of impacts of various ways of measuring ecosystem services that I've mentioned, like biodiversity and carbon storage and so on. So this has been done previously in detail by very large teams with a very large budget. So I'm not trying to replicate what they've done, and at the same time I recognise the limitations of a one-person small grant team looking into a vast area. So I'm trying to narrow this down into looking at the theories that help us to explain both human and business economic behaviour around natural capital, but also narrowing down what really are we interested in here. And I think that where I'm heading towards, and I'd value anyone's feedback on this, is the idea that land value has traditionally been thought of as how much is the market willing to pay, or perhaps how much are these developments going to be worth at the point of sale. And that perhaps there's an inefficiency, an economic inefficiency there, in that in the process of choosing land for build, for example, or for purchase, there's not necessarily an adequate exploration and decomposition of the value of the environmental assets, the natural capital assets on the land. I'm not going to go into great detail about literature review, again in the interests of time here, but I'm happy to share the slides with anybody who's interested. What I will say is that there have been numerous studies to look at these valuation techniques. It's not just an abstract concept. For example, the idea that these environmental assets, that national parks, for instance, that are shared among different countries, offer us a well-being boost. This is an economic valuation technique where the subjective well-being of persons in an area where a policy is being enacted can be measured pre and post policy, let's say, and the other drivers of well-being can be isolated and effectively absorbed out of the model. And then you can look at, well, what's the impact of the policy on a person's subjective well-being using econometrics. And if you also have a study which looks at, well, what's the well-being impact of income on well-being, you can translate or transliterate the income value of a shift in subjective well-being, let's say from a 4 to a 5 in happiness, and say, well, it looks like the policy of having a park in this area, for instance, has an equivalent financial economic value of X or Y. I think that's an interesting methodology. And there are a number of studies that have looked at valuing both restoration projects and the sort of flood risk reduction, for instance, value of trees and forests and woodlands. I did a piece of work on hedgerows and hedgerow mapping last year, which involved looking at LiDAR laser data to measure the heights of trees and hedgerows and woodlands, and machine learning to trace the location on aerial photography maps. So there's work going into this area that I think is important. I've drawn up this sort of what I call a theoretical framework, which is really my understanding of what's going on. When I teach my students about theoretical frameworks, I try to take the theoretical framework out of the theoretical framework, because it's a bit of a clunky pair of words, and sort of try to say this is your opportunity to communicate your conceptual understanding of what's going on here in the literature, of what's going on here in this research area. And I think one of the key messages that it's not quite clear whether this is the case, but the idea is that the more we put a value on nature, the more we research nature, the more that businesses will cotton on to the need to value nature, that we're actually having an impact as participants in the process of research, in the process of sharing our research and conducting academic research, in influencing corporate policy towards the environment, and also informing and helping, hopefully, policymakers to make better evidence-based decisions in the process. So this piece of research has some funding. It has had some hosting support from JCU, which is greatly appreciated. Academics, institutions, policymakers, government colleagues, NGOs, the public and nature are probably the stakeholders in this research. I need to conduct a literature review, some site visits I've started to do. I will do some reflective blogging, networking and interviews to pursue further data about what we're talking about here. And then I'm looking to get a couple of publications out of it, and maybe a prototype model that not can rival in any way the TEEB idea, but at least offers perhaps a back of cigarette packet alternative to something more complex, given the timescales involved. And then this will then lead to collaborations with colleagues internationally, perhaps redefining the academic and policy divide, and hopefully invigorating the Singapore-UK connection to have a positive impact on society. So why Singapore and the United Kingdom then? It's a bit odd, isn't it? They're very far apart. But actually, there are many commonalities. We're Commonwealth. We have a shared history, culture, and language. We are finance-centric economies. We rely heavily on financial services. We are developed and high-income countries, insular, multicultural, and have nature reserves. We participate in UN climate change events. We signed the Green Economy Pact in March, pretty much since I arrived, which is to promote green transport, low carbon technologies, and green finance. And in fact, in October at Marina Bay Sands, there's going to be the World Agritech and Food Tech Summit, which will also involve businesses getting together, working on similar issues. And that's being organised by a UK-based company based in Brighton as the events organiser and promoter. So we have that in common. We also have a shared common law framework to an extent. There are some clear differences. For example, I noted that yesterday in the news there was the invocation of the theft by a servant law, which we don't have anymore in the United Kingdom. But we do share that common law idea of an independent and impartial judiciary. What's different then? Well, the size is quite clear. Singapore is probably smaller than London. So there's a different size. Tropical versus temperate climate. Who are you bordered with, and what do they offer in terms of both air pollution coming over the border and in terms of potential carbon savings? And obviously there's more agriculture left in the United Kingdom than there is in Singapore. So there are some differences as well, but I think that they are useful comparators for the reasons stated there. So I think I've had pretty much my 25-30 minutes to explore some of the areas that I'm seeking to look at. I just conclude with some photographs just to sort of bring to life a little bit some of the things that we've been talking about. obviously, animals in agriculture are one of the largest sources of methane. So there's efforts in the UK to and in other countries. I've been involved in some chairing some bilateral meetings as well over the years, and there are efforts to bring things like precision technology into farming, which is probably less relevant to the Singapore case. But the conservation work on national parks is obviously shared and critical. This was at the British Club. That top photo was at the British Club, just north of here in Singapore, and I was actually going for a swim, or seeking to go for a swim, and I wanted a pair of goggles to go into the water, and I was quite willing to buy a pair of goggles, and in fact, these staff at the British Club said, "Come with us," and they took me into the inner sanctum of the British Club to this crate of goggles with probably 30 or 40 years of teenagers enjoying their leisure activity in the club, leaving their goggles by the side of the pool, and mum and dad just saying, "Oh, I'll buy a new pair of goggles." So 40 years worth of goggles in the British Club, and I thought it's just a fantastic example, a cute example in a way of upcycling and what's the term? Where you are able to reuse plastics in a way that My Halo does, which is a company that I spotted in Boogies, where the idea of taking your laptop batteries for purchase by new buyers or recycling. So this is very visible in Singapore. Actually, it's all over the MRT network. There's clearly a public messaging that I think the UK can learn a lot from. If I'm honest with you, I think there's a lot of public health and public environmental awareness messaging that the Singaporean government is doing very, very well, and ought to be complimented on and recognised for. This is very visible, but the impact that it's having and the need is perhaps unexplored territory. It's territory that I'd like to explore more. And these are just some examples in the UK of areas that I've been to, and as you begin to take more of an interest in these ideas, you start to notice more where the assets are. I mean, I believe, and I started this lecture by saying that we take these assets for granted. And I believe that we take them for granted because we don't understand how valuable they are, and we can attribute an economic value to them through these methods and mechanisms and cross-cutting multidisciplinary approaches and studies and research and papers that have been produced over the years and continue to be produced. These trees here, they're not necessarily known. There may be ancient woodland, in which case they will be known, but they're not necessarily mapped and well known by the government and by the public. But when we go past them, we should realise that even the detritus from the trees, even the leaves that fall down, help contribute to the word I was looking for actually was circular. Of course, and I know we've got an expert in Eijdenberg in the room who works on circular economy. I recognise this is very early stage, and so I haven't been able to give you much data yet because I'm 3 weeks into this and really exploring it. But I hope that gives you a little bit of insight into perhaps where I'm headed or what I'm trying to do in terms of looking at some of these issues and beginning to sort of ask some interesting questions around it. I'll just finish with this slide actually. The question of whether a site is greenfield or brownfield, and should we build more on brownfield or not? It's actually not quite as clear-cut a question as you might think. This is actually, you'd probably think that this particular slide here on the bottom left of the slide is greenfield. Well, it is greenfield in a sense. It's grassland and there are some landscape features of trees, but actually this is a man-made garden designed by Capability Brown in the 19th or 18th century. It's Chatsworth House in Derbyshire. So, probably greenfield, and it's not going to get built on, but, is it really greenfield if it's been designed? Clearly, Peak District National Park, on one of my hikes in the summer in England, this is conservation land. It's a part of protected sites strategy and protected sites. It's greenfield. Finally, then, this is Fort Canning in Singapore, and this is arguably a brownfield site, because I think it was some hotels, or I think it was some offices perhaps before. There's been some demolition to the right-hand side. But as you can see, it's used as a cut-through path. You can see somebody walking on it right now. It's a useful shortcut for people who've come out of Fort Canning Station and are trying to get down to the Singapore River. It's also a site for birds. I've spotted some birds there looking for worms, seeming to be gasping for some water as well, so I gave them a bottle cap full of water, picked up the bottle cap later on in the day, I have to admit. But I left the bottle cap there, but I did come back and collect it. So it's going to be built on. It's going to be made into hotels. So there's clear economic value from that, but I think that the debate needs to be had and the discussion needs to be had to just ensure that the due diligence is being done around, well, we're going to make use of this site, we're going to get some hotels from it, we're going to get more, it's going to fulfill tourism needs, it's going to fulfill economic needs for the local businesses, but there's going to be biodiversity loss, even if it's just grass. There's going to be biodiversity loss, and there's going to be loss of amenity, because that cut-through path is no longer going to exist. So I'm sure this has been considered, but I thought it was an interesting illustration because it also reflects an area of land just opposite my home, where I was able to work with the local community to prevent a developer, in that case, from developing the land, because it was inappropriate to use what was effectively a village green to build commercial flats when there was a statistical lack of green space in the area for the local community. So I'm not an activist in this area whatsoever, but the more I think one educates oneself on the value of these assets, the more passionate one becomes about wanting to communicate about it, because this is something that means a great deal to all of us, okay, now and in future, for future generations. So thank you very much for allowing me to share with you, and thank you, Emiel, for your hosting and chairmanship, and I will be very happy to take any questions, although I can't promise that I'll be able to answer them to any huge ability. Thank you very much.
Got some questions coming in online, but also here in the room, and therefore would like to hear a bit more about your thoughts about the questions that are raised by a number of our colleagues and people who attended in the Zoom room. So one of the questions is, what is your take of the energy transition in different parts of the world? How does that relate to the story about your story about valuing natural resources?
Thanks, that's a very interesting question. I'm aware as well that I'm in the presence of colleagues who are vastly more experienced in these spheres, and I almost want to delegate to them on these kinds of questions. However, the knowledge I do have in this realm, I would say that it's a great question, first of all, and there are two possible ways to answer this. One is to think about, where is energy headed? In the UK, it's generally accepted that there has been a pricing crisis, if you like. It's sometimes termed as a cost of living crisis, though that's a slightly politicised term, which includes the prices of bills for generalised utility use going up considerably for the average household. And so work, for instance, by I'm aware of by the UK Infrastructure Bank, which is currently a public institution, but if it goes the same way as the UK Green Investment Bank, it could become a very successful commercial and private organisation over the long term. And I'm conscious of work that's being done in that area to look at energy storage and electricity storage in grids in particular, and the ebbs and flows of demand over time. So, for example, when it gets hot in Singapore, you're likely to turn your aircon down, right, to get a lower temperature. It doesn't tend to get cold in Singapore, so there's probably less needs of heating and electricity. Perhaps in the evening you cook more, so you're using more electricity. So most models, as I understand it, of billing for electricity, for example, work on a static kilowatt hour type basis. But is there scope for a variable rate in electricity charges, given demand and supply and storage and release of this kind of energy for consumer use? I think that's one area that's worthy of further exploration. There's also, of course, the question of whether or not developing economies that are seeking to and are growing and expanding, whether that's China or Bangladesh, the Philippines, Thailand, Laos, or anywhere else in particular that is experiencing the benefits of both economic growth and labour cost advantage, for instance, whether to accelerate growth, particularly the non-mainland China, Greater China region, emulating Chinese success, but driven by the use of coal power, the use of coal. This is something that's not my original thought. It's something I've taken directly from Gates's 2022 book that mentions this. Is that a concern? And Gates, the entrepreneur Gates, argues that it's still the responsibility, particularly of the developed nations, to take a lead on this, not only to reduce the chances of serious long-term disaster, but also because the economic benefits that developing technology in this area will bring in the short, medium and long term outweighs not investing into the areas, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So a bit more specifically, how do you weigh cost and benefit of renewable energy such as hydroelectricity, as it definitely will cause harm to the environment at first? Is it worth it?
Okay, so again, not particularly an area that I'm a knowledge or even subject matter expert in. I would have to say to you on that. More broadly speaking, in cost-benefit analysis, I would say that certainly for investment, I mean, we need to look at government as the largest investor in product, or the largest procurer of products and services in every country. So when there is a market failure and the government is going to intervene, there will be that we can have the expectation that there will be commercial benefits to organisations whose services are procured. Now, if that means investment into hydroelectric power, for instance, then you would expect that there would be a rigorous and diligent process of exploration of the costs and benefits of such a public investment into the spheres. And if there were significant harms identified, you would then perhaps expect an intervention in the opposite direction. Although particularly in market economies, government interventions in the opposite direction are less desirable for the reasons that are quite clear of a free market basis of economies among free market nations. But what I would say is that when the costs and benefits of such a program are assessed, they will be weighed up. So you would not imagine that government might subsidise or promote or be invested particularly in that area if it's identified that the costs outweigh the benefits. I think that the question of, I know May Tam Mullins has a hand up. I might want to comment on this, or have another question. But it's a good question. I think the question is, does it cause more harm? Does it cause more harm than good? Yeah. I don't know the answer, but my take on it would be that if there was investment going into that area that involved the public purse, for instance, then those costs and benefits will be weighed up. And if there's investment going into that area from the private purse, then again, whether or not an intervention is needed would also be weighed up by the officials working on that energy area. I don't know if anyone else has any comment on that, but that's what I would say about it.
So step in, yeah, Peter.
I have a couple of questions, but I don't see them coming up.
They're here.
Oh,
I've got them here.
didn't see.
Or I think I got them here.
No. We talk a lot from the economic valuation perspective, but I think that's part of the problem. So I think you need to consider a more broader perspective, because this is about political power. So the perspective, who is dominating the discussion, what other perspectives are being used, an economic valuation perspective, well, here it is. By definition means that it's connected to commerce, and so a different perspective is more from an environmental standpoint, where you say, we're clearly getting across quite a number of significant thresholds that are affecting the planet, and of course also at a national level. We just need to make sure that we go. So money doesn't matter. We just have to do that. If you get an economic valuation perspective, by definition, you are going to go into certain areas where you might still affect nature because the economic benefits are mostly commercial, and so that's a very different sort of perspective. Where does it come from? I think it's very important. The coalitions, the power that is derived from that, who is part of that, is very important. We see a movement towards a stronger coalition with environmental voices and societal, and I think that's an interesting perspective, I think, to consider.
Thanks very much, Peter, for your comments. That's extremely valuable. If I may just comment back very briefly, I mentioned housing development need, and that's clearly an area where there's a dominant commercial power that also benefits society from what it does. But I think in this area, this is where academics can have a moderating influence on the narrative and on the discussions by looking at, well, is this lobby which is saying we need support to build more? If we look at the data, is that really the case? And I've looked at the data, for instance, in the UK, pre-2008, post-2008, pre-COVID, post-COVID, and the trajectory of housing build against the forecasted costs and shrinkages in house building and house building costs. But I think we do need to unpick, one of our roles, I do believe, is to unpick that as independent, autonomous academic people, so that, in effect, an evidence-based narrative can inform policymakers in addition to potentially biased approach. Thank you.
I think it touches upon a number of other questions here in the list about the economic or the monetary, the numbered value you put on certain natural resources. And in your case, some of the pictures that I've seen about parks, natural parks, and either man-made or natural parks. However, the flip side of that would a non-monetary value of that, and perceiving things from a more maybe attitudinal or psychological and other perspective instead of numbering items.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a book that's focused specifically. I can't recall the author right now. That's focused specifically on the idea that pricing of environmental assets is the wrong thing to do. It's a normative position, but it states that the spiritual value of these experiences that we can have is indeed priceless. That the experience of awe, the experience of gratitude, the experience of a simple sunset after a long day at work, and what that does for us in terms of being refreshing, in giving us a sense of connection, maybe higher power awareness, it is profound. I definitely think there's a qualitative side to this, a psychological side to this, and I know that there's an expert in the department, Denise Dillon, who has expertise in this area as well, and I'd encourage anyone who's interested in that to look at her research into values and how how we value as human beings things like nature, the importance of such experiences in our values hierarchy and the structure of our psyche.
Sure. Let me get back to to the questions. One question from the room was, the person has missed earlier parts. Could you perhaps share a little bit more about the externality effect that can be measured? Do you do the field trips and the surveys gather that type of information of your study?
Yeah, again, good question. I think I'd need to ask the person who asked that question, what positive externalities or negative externalities are you referring to? So, one negative externality of agricultural farming, as I've just discussed, is the runoff of pesticides into the water system. A potential positive externality of promoting awareness among communities is that they tell their friends and families, and it snowballs into a public attitude towards plastic recycling, for instance, or the use of less plastic, which becomes naturally self-perpetuating. There's a hawker centre in Zion Centre near the Great World, and I just happened to note that I was in Singapore in July last year, and the guy was selling fruit drinks, and every fruit drink had a plastic cup, a plastic cover, and a plastic bag. And now he offers a drink-in option where you get a plastic cup which can be washed up. So the process is dynamic, and I think there are subtle shifts just from that observation. I mean, it's anecdotal, but I think there are subtle shifts that are occurring in society in Singapore. And I think that is greatly helped by the awareness among the conservationists, environmentalists, scientists, and policy officials who are doing a great job of looking at this and making it accessible to the public. There's obviously more work to be done, but it's something, as I've said before, I think needs to be commended.
Neil is asking, how would you try and incorporate a transformation from marine greenfield sites to the reclaimed terrestrial brownfield sites? Sorry for my pronunciation.
Thank you. This is a very contentious question, actually, because there is, as I'm not the expert on Singapore, I'm new to Singapore, and this is a new area of research, but as I understand it from conversations that I've had with colleagues and taxi drivers, there's a lot of reclamation going on in Singapore, and there has been over a great many years. So there is a contentious question of harms to the marine spheres, and the biggest contentious question, and this is very controversial, it has to be said, is what will the neighbours say if in future there are international commitments to make reparations for harms done? And who needs to pay for that? So this is definitely something that needs to be thought about. And yes, it's a difficult question, and it's a difficult thing to have discussions about openly, but we need to do that. I think we need to be able to ask these sorts of questions and explore the answers around them. The greatest example at Singapore, and unfortunately it's one of the saddest, and it's not one of, it's not something that we can possibly blame Lee Kuan Yew for, because the knowledge, as I say, wasn't there, and the science is evolving. I know we're celebrating Lee Kuan Yew's 100th birthday quite soon as well. But the fact is, and research at NUS shows that the coral reef destruction in Singapore since the 1960s has been profoundly devastating to the local islands and to the local coral reefs. And we know from research by people like Benias et al. In 2009 that, yes, restoration efforts do make a difference, but even restoration efforts through human policy and interaction with the environment gets not really anywhere near close achieving the sorts of levels of biodiversity and ecosystem services that were there before. So this is problematic, very problematic as a question, and I definitely think it is, now is the time with these commitments being made, that everybody is going to need to look at that balance between the need for reclamation and land and the need to protect sites and services, and make restoration and reparation a priority. And that's a normative position, okay? I'm an economist, I'm allowed to have normative positions and attitudes. But it's one that's shared vastly among those who seem to be driving the narrative here. So, you know, unashamedly making the comment that people need to be aware of the needs for reparation.
Talking about awareness, and maybe the last question. You recently have been to Japan.
True.
What made you aware, and what are the lessons learned from that place related to your story?
Okay, so we all know Japan as a high-tech society, you know, a leader in technology. And my observations in Japan were that there is less of public messaging that I could see around the sorts of areas that I'm talking about. So I think if there's a race going on, that Singapore is vastly in the lead in terms of raising awareness of this. But that might be because it needs to be making more change. My sort of takeaway from Japan is that, and this is probably happening in Singapore as well, that there is technology that's looking at net zero robotics, for instance, for delivery of goods and services, for things like taking goods off of shelves, packaging them, sending them around, even taking them around and delivering them. So I would say that Japan is working, as might be expected, in the area of technology and engineering to solve some of these issues, and is probably, you know, going to steal the lead in that space through research. Yeah.
All right, Sam. Thank you so much. Any remain or last questions or remarks from the people left here in the room? No? Then I would like to thank you very, very, very much for your lecture today. Very insightful.
Thank you, Emiel.
Thanks for your time.
Thank you, everybody, and
We're going
thanks to the
wrap
online
up.
people as
I
well.
think there's one QR code left, Erica, for people to express their views. It's a satisfaction poll, also for the people online. And then we're going to wrap it up.
Okay, very grateful. Thank you, everybody.